Chapter 1. The Gift. He ran his feet in the rushing water and soaked in all the beauty and splendor of the setting sun on the Indian Ocean. Many thoughts occupied his mind on his last night in the village. The townlet was all he ever knew. Aman woke the next morning when the alarm rang. Jumped out of bed, washed his face and reached for his backpack, sitting on the chair by the small table. He looked at the surrounding walls of the room, took a long deep breath and stepped outside. Standing by the door was Anna, clutching on a little pouch, a farewell gift, which she then slid into the side pocket of his backpack. They walked down the narrow lane, along the sidewalls in silence, until they reached the main road where the ride was waiting. They then hugged and said goodbye. The van rolls down the bend with Aman looking back, waving until Anna got out of sight. The ride will take him eastwards to a town on the east coast, where he will see the waters of the Straits of Malacca for the first time. He had read about those faraway places and heard stories from travelers who had stayed at the Tanjung Inn, where he had worked. Anna, being his closest friend since his days at school, often reminded him to have some kind of plan. But the foremost thing on his mind was to find work when he gets there. The road gradually winds up the mountain. Kale turned to offer him a little snack. Pooja, the driver, who is also Kale's husband, then said that it will take a bit longer than usual to get to their destination due to the monsoon rain. There will be fallen trees and landslides and many detours, he warned. Pooja and Kale, both in their late 30s, run a small business selling artifacts to locals and tourists on the East Coast. Twice a year, they would make trips to the West Coast to obtain artifacts from the region. The van was filled to the brim with ornaments like wooden carvings, statues, paintings and traditional Indonesian musical instruments, which they had acquired primarily from the local artists, sculptors, and luthiers. Aman expressed his gratitude for their kindness. He thanked them for offering him the ride. "It's all right, Aman," Kale acknowledged. "Besides," she continued, "it is good to have someone else to talk to. My husband's only concern is for the goods." Pooja peeked at Aman through the rearview mirror and smiled. "Aman, you will discover the people in the East diverse and therefore interesting," he said as though to change the subject. Kale then switched on the radio, and immediately there was some Karanchong music playing from the radio station in that area. After a couple of hours up the jungle mountain road, the van suddenly rattled as it hit a bump. Pooja looked back to see if nothing had fallen out of its place. Up ahead there were fallen trees, broken branches, and leaves strewed across the road. He drove slowly and carefully to avoid any more sudden bumps. "A strong wind must have hit this area last night," he said. It had taken about an hour before they were back on a clear path. The road then left the jungle into a clearing. Aman looked down to the meadows in the valley. He thought about how beautiful the scenery is and wished that Anna was with him. It's just before noon, the time when they would go spearfishing at low tide. When they got down to the valley, Pooja made a left turn onto a dirt road. When they reached the end, he stopped. Kale got out of the vehicle and exclaimed, "Lunchtime." Aman stretched his legs, for it was a bit of cramp where he was seated among the artifacts. Pooja, standing from the roof of the van, handed him a box of cookery. Kale then filled a pot with rice grains and walked to a nearby stream. "Come follow me, Aman. The mountain stream is cooling. You can dip your feet in it," she said. The midday sun was right overhead, and he did find relief in the cool waters. but his mind was still back there with Anna. He struggled to shake it out of his mind, for the sentiment was new and unexpected. He looked up and saw Kale looking at him smiling. "Come, let's go make some lunch," she said. It rained occasionally when they got back on the road. There were a few detours due to flooding from the brooks and rivers. When they got to the rolling hills, the sun was way past the zenith. The slanting shadows point the way to Amon's dream unknown. The mood had changed, as though he had just stumbled upon a positive light. He then dared himself to run his fingers to the side pocket of his backpack and clutched onto the pouch, Anna's gift. Gently, he loosens the string to unveil the content. Amon chuckled softly as he remembered that day she picked this seashell and put it to her ear while blowing into his, to simulate the sound. They arrived at the outskirts of town around midnight. "Wake up, Kale, we're nearly there," Pooja said as he nudged her arm. She woke in a daze, rubbed her eyes, sits upright to check out the surroundings. She then reached for her bag between her feet for bottles of mineral water and turned to Amon and gave him one. "Did you get a shut-eye at all, Amon?" she asked. "No," he replied. "Everything's new to his eyes that he wouldn't want to miss anything," Pooja remarked with a soft chuckle. Amon's excitement overrides his tiredness, having not slept much from the night before. "We got a bed for you when we get there, and you can sleep for as long as you want," Kale said. "Oh, I prefer not to trouble you both." "Just drop me anywhere along the way," Amon said politely. Pooja looked back momentarily and said, "Never argue with the Lady Amon. What she says goes. Besides, we've got a spare room, and you can stay until you get on your feet." Amon was at a loss for words. He never felt so much kindness from where he came. Being brought up in an orphanage from a very early age, he always considered himself streetwise, even in his small village. But at the same time, he felt so grateful and relieved that he didn't have to go look for shelter in the middle of the night in an unfamiliar place. Not long after, they were at the front gate of the house. "We will have a light supper, and then I'll show you to your room," Kale said as she got out of the van to open the gate. The sun shone through the bedroom window as Amon awoke. There he laid, looking at the shadows the sunlight had cast on the ornaments on the windowsill with half-slit eyes. He looked at the clock on the bedside table, and it was 10 o'clock. Then he noticed the bedsheets were soft and clean with light batik designs. As he sat up to stand, something caught his eye. On the bed's edge sat a little girl. Trying not to appear surprised, Amon greeted her good morning. "Good morning," she replied with a smile so innocent you can only see in a child. "My name is Amon. What's your name?" he asked. "My name is Adalia," she replied, with curiosity written all over that cute little pretty face. She had big brown eyes and dark hair down to her shoulders. She must be around 4 years of age, he thought. "I'm 5 years old, and next year I will start school," she said, as though reading his thoughts. Suddenly, there was a woman's voice coming from the other part of the house, calling out for Adalia. She slid herself off the bed and skipped out the door. Amon followed her to a kitchen area. There stood an elderly woman in front of the stove cooking. She turned to him and said, "Good morning, you must be hungry for some breakfast. Come take a seat." "Good morning," Amon replied, as Adalia ushered him to a chair next to her. "Today's breakfast is Adalia's favorite," she said, smiling at her. The three of them sat there eating the special Sumatran fried rice. Amon finished his full plate and commented that it was the best fried rice he ever tasted. Adalia nodded her little head while still chomping on the food. After a shower and a change of clothes, Amon joined them in the backyard of the terrace house. He noticed that the opposite row of houses shared the same backyard design, fenced in each with its unique look. Adalia told me that your name is Amon. You can just call me Oba. I'm here to care for the house and Adalia when Pooja and Kale are out and about doing their business, Oba said. He then realized that the van is not there at the front of the house where they parked last night. Are they out on business now, Oba? He asked. Yes. They left early this morning, and usually will take a few days before they return, she said. They also told me that you can stay here as long as you need to, and asked me to help you with any questions you may have, she continued. You can ask me anything too, Amon, Adalia interrupted. They all laughed. It all seems like he had made the correct decision to make the journey to the east, he thought to himself. He felt positive and elated at that moment. He stroked Adalia's hair and kissed her on the cheek. She smiled, as though saying that everything will be all right. Oba then went inside and returned with a shoebox. In it, there was a map of the town, a few pen markers and an envelope. She first unfolds the map and laid it on the garden table. We are here, she said, pointing to the red circle she just made with the marker. Adalia squeezed herself onto Amon's lap. Show Amon my school, Oba, she requested. Oba patiently took a green marker and circled an area where the school stood. The school is nearby. It's a good landmark if you ever get lost, Oba explained. Thank you, Adalia, Amon said and kissed the top of her head. After marking a few other important landmarks, Oba reached for the envelope and handed it to him. Amon opened it and was quite shocked to see the money in the envelope. I can't possibly accept this, Oba. Pooja and Kale have done so much for me already. I just can't thank them enough, he cried. Haha, I was warned that you would say something like that. They said it's a loan. You can pay it back whenever you can, she said with a giggle. Amon felt confident that he could one day pay his debt, and said, It's so good to be here, Oba. She held both his hands with an assuring grip and said, We wish you all the best, my dear. Chapter 2. Broken Sails and Rudders. Everything seems to be conveniently close in the small town. Even though it's so much bigger than his little townlet, he felt very much at home. In no time, Amon got to know people, especially from the local eatery, where workers gather for their lunch break. One man in particular, Art from Java, who has good prospects for getting Amon a full-time job. So far, he gets only a variety of odd jobs, from washing dishes to mending fishing nets and sails. Being in a seaside town, he often meets sailors and yachtsmen from as far as Australia and New Zealand. He had worked on their broken sails and rudders at the town's shipyard. Even though not a shipwright, he was a quick learner under expert tutelage and had acquired a certain trust among the shipyard's clients. In the morning he would go where the fishing boats come in. He gets work there carrying buckets of seafood for the early morning buyers to their vehicles. Though the wages was low, he had managed to save, paid off all of his debt, and rented a small room for himself in town. Whenever he had spare time, he would go visit Pooja, Kale, Oba, and little Adalia. They have become his family, and often he was invited for dinner at the house. Frequently, he thought of his good friend Anna. It has been a year since he left the village, and he's got many stories to share with her. It so happened that Peugeot and Kale had just returned from their recent trip there. Amon reminded them of Anna, his friend who had sent him off on his journey, and they remembered her. "Oh, by the way, when we were there at the village, we had come to know that your friend Anna had married her cousin through a pre-arrangement made between their families," Pooja said. "They had a big wedding, with musicians and dancers, where nearly the whole village was invited," Kale added. Amon smiled to hide his surprise. "Oh, that's nice. I wished I was there to attend my best friend's wedding," he said. There is a favorite place, a special place where he often visits after a hard day's work. A place he had thought he would share with Anna someday. The lighthouse, perched at the rocky edge of the bay, lights up as night falls. The flickering boat lights across the horizon. All that and more he wanted to share. But that night, the incoming wind was colder, and the moon seemed lonesome. There he laid on his favorite park bench, curled up and fell asleep. He was awoken the next morning by the sound of seagulls on a feeding frenzy. He rubbed his eyes, and the morning sun glittered through a row of trees. In a daze, he scanned the surroundings to orient himself. At the edge of the park stood a man holding a bucket, feeding the seagulls. Then he spotted the old colonial clock tower, and that his place is just a short walk from there. He walked past the man with the bucket and noticed that he was feeding the birds with fish spoils, guts and all. Food stalls were scattered along the sides of the clock tower. He was famished and stopped for some breakfast. Among the locals, there were some foreigners, tourists mainly, and sailors from the merchant ships. This small town, noted for its street food, is a favorite stopover location for the seafarers. As he sat there waiting to be served, a gentleman approached his table. "Is this seat taken?" he asked. Amon looked up and was astonished to see his friend. "Hi, Art. Surprised to see you here. Didn't you say that you were going to visit your family in Bali?" Amon asked. "Change of plan, brother. My work demanded that I stay," he said, as he waved to get the waiter's attention. "Do you remember the job I told you about?" Art continued. "Oh yes," Amon eagerly replied. "Well, we're having a meeting tonight at the old wharf. The meeting is at 8 o'clock. Can you make it?" He whispered, as though he didn't want anybody else to hear. "Yes, I'll be there at 1:45, Amon also responded softly. He could sense something odd and mysterious is about to unfold, but he was ready to take on the offer. He got nothing holding him back now, he thought to himself. After they had breakfast, Art stood up and walked to pay the bill. As he was about to leave, he patted Amon on his back and said, "See you at the rendezvous." Amon felt quite anxious about the meeting ahead. He tried to sleep for a few hours but could not, anticipating the night's appointment. Somehow, his tiredness, for not getting proper sleep the past nights, got the better of him, and he managed to get a couple of hours of sleep. By 7:30 he was already there at the old wharf. Nobody else was there as he sat waiting at the edge of the platform, dangling his feet underneath the wharf's light by the edge of the water. From where he sat, he could still see the clock tower in between the shophouses. It's already 8:15, and still nobody's in sight. Suddenly, he heard the sound of a motorboat approaching. At first, he could not tell where the sound was coming from. Then out from the darkness, it appeared. It's a fishing trawler. As it got closer, it slowed down until it's right in front of where he was sitting. "Come aboard," a voice called out to him. It was Art, with a few other people with him. Amon carefully negotiated the slippery floor and got on board. He was then briefly introduced to the others. Some of them could have been new recruits just like him, he thought. They were men and women of many races, and even though it was dark, he could still distinguish their faces by the light of the pale moon. He counted that there were 8 of them in the boat, including himself, consisting of 5 males and 3 females. It was quite a windy night. He could see that they are heading for choppy waters from the lights of the distant fishing boats, bopping up and down, side to side. As they got further out to sea, it got a bit calmer, and when the clouds cleared, the full moon was at the brightest. Amon looked back to the shoreline and saw the sporadic light of the lighthouse, which was only slightly visible. The stars were shining so brightly, just like in his little village, where he often slept on the beach on warm, humid nights. He felt sadness, but the sheer vastness, the moon, stars and the glimmering sea were too overwhelming, that he had to surrender to it all. He looked around him and noticed that everyone else were just as odd as he was. Art suddenly appeared from the front of the trawler. He asked if everybody was all right, and they all nodded without saying a word. Chow, Art's assistant, came from behind him, with a large rectangular wooden box. Then he laid it down and opened the box for all to see. Inside there were fishing rods and accessories. Among them were metal clamps and brackets. Art then assembled them on the sides of the boat. After assembling all of them, 2 on each side, Chow placed a fishing rod on each of them. Art then sat next to Amon. "You must be wondering what your task is," he said with his arm over Amon's shoulders. Amon looked bewildered. "Well, the fishing rods are for our guests," Art continued. "Twice a week, we take tourists out on fishing trips and stop over at the island for a night and a day. We will sail back to the mainland before sunset tomorrow," he said. Amon was surprised to hear about the island. Art then noticed his puzzled face and pointed to the northeast. There, under the light of the moon, Amon caught a glimpse of a dark silhouette of a mountain. A look of excitement then showed on his face. "What's my task then, Art?" he asked. "Well, since you know quite a bit about boats, having worked at the shipyard, you will be in charge of the trawler," Art obliged, waiting for assurance from him. Amon does know quite a lot about fishing boats. While at the shipyard, he listened and learned diligently from his peers, and he was well liked by them. They even said that he was ready to one day go out to work at sea. "I will do my best, Art. I will work out a work routine, and I won't disappoint you," he said reassuringly. They both laughed over the handshake. The lines cast, and the tourists sat on their seats waiting for the fish to bite. Amon walked across to the front of the boat and noticed that they were not that far away from the island. He could see clusters of light from the villages scattered along the shoreline. There were also other fishing trawlers to the north and south. They must have come from the island, he thought, for he did not remember seeing them alongside their boat on the way there. Then he wondered if those were the night boats he had seen from his favorite spot on the mainland. The island was the mystery to him at that moment, for he could not recall seeing it from the mainland, even in the day. He suddenly heard cheering and laughter coming from the back of the boat, and rushed to join the celebrations. They just caught a couple of big fish, and another one was on the line. The boat slowly steered to the island. As they approached the shore, Amon could see huts, perched on the hill's slope, with a pathway that led down to the jetty area. It was dimly lit. Art maneuvered the boat skillfully, and carefully docked by the pontoon. "Here is where we moor the boat," he said, and showed Amon a thing or two about mooring. The guests are shown to their huts where they're going to spend the night. Amon, with another one of the crew member, helped them with their catch and gear. "Sorry, we were not formally introduced," she said. "My name is Lavenda. I am the cook, among other things that I'm assigned to do," she said, smiling. "Hi, I'm Amon," he responded. In his excitement from the night's experience, he had forgotten about the woman he was casually introduced to at the beginning of the trip. "We are going to have a feast for supper tonight," Lavenda said. Amon noticed the warmth in her, and thought that she could be in her mid-30s. She looked like somebody from northern India. He knew a few workmates on the mainland from up there, and he could recognize the accent. "Just find an empty hut for yourself, Amon, and then, if you like, you can help me in the kitchen," she said. Amon counted 8 huts altogether. They were not large, but looked cozy, with hanging adjustable gas lamps in each of them. The huts were not too far apart from each other, and the one closest to the jetty is the kitchen. It was slightly larger than the others, with a roofed extension on the side of it, where a long dining table stood facing the sea. There were also lazy chairs, side tables, and hammocks tied to the surrounding trees. After the guests have settled, they made their way to the dining area. Amon helped Lavenda lay the table with plates, forks and spoons, and served the food. Chow then suddenly appeared with bottles of local coconut toddy he had acquired from a neighboring village. Everybody was upbeat, and together they ate, drank, and sang under the waning moon. Chapter 3. Bare Feet in the Water. It was a beautiful morning when Amon woke up. The sky was light blue and the air was crisp. The sun had just peeped over the mountain behind him. He looked down to the pontoon area and saw Art and Chow walking on the ramp towards the trawler carrying fresh green coconuts. As he walked down the path, he noticed that all the huts were equipped with a tub and a toilet on the side. He then heard Lavenda calling out, "Hey Amon, good morning," from the kitchen window, where they were last night. All the guests were already there having breakfast. "Good morning, everybody," he said, and they greeted back in unison. "Come and join us," said one of the guests. Lavenda then served him a plate of nasi lemak, the local breakfast favorite. "Art didn't want to wake you up early because he thought you needed the rest on your first trip out," she said. "Everyone seems to be in a good mood." They sat there talking, sharing experiences and telling travel stories. Art and Chow then came to the dining area. "How are you feeling, Amon?" Chow asked. "I'm fine, Chow," he replied. Art looked on, smiling. He then laid a list, program for the day, on the table for the guests, which created some excitement all around. After breakfast, they started to walk down the narrow path by the ramp onto the beach. There was a soft sea breeze blowing from the southeast, and only some scattered clouds to the west. After a short walk, they reached a rocky area with big boulders jutting out to the water. It was the perfect place for fishing, with only little waves gently hitting the shore. While Chow stayed with the guests to organize the fishing gear and bait, Art nudged him on to follow him. "We are going to visit a friend of mine who lives here on the island," he said. They walked for a while along the beach until they came upon a small village. Little children were running around kicking a soccer ball on the sand. As they walked into the village, they passed chicken coos and goats in their enclosures. Wooden houses, with zinc roofs and cemented floors, were randomly scattered. "We are here," Art suddenly said. There, between two bushy flowering plants, sat two men on rattan chairs in front of the house. "Good morning, Art," the elder of the two said as he got up. "Good morning, Sob," Art replied. The younger man also stood up. "This is my son-in-law Jammu," Sob said. Art then introduced Aman to them both, and they all shook hands. After the brief introduction, they all walked to the back of the house. There were fruit trees scattered in the backyard, and under one of them stood a wooden table with long benches on either side. Jammu then walked into the house through the back door. Aman sat facing Art and Sob. Jammu quickly returned with water canteens in a sling bag and sat next to Aman. He then took out a paper wrap from the side pocket of his bag and gave it to Sob, who then put it into his front shirt pocket. They sat there for a while having light conversations about how the fishermen on the island were mistreated by the big guns of the fishing industry. Aman and Jammu just sat there listening, while Sob and Art did most of the talking. Suddenly, a long whistled sound came out from the woods behind the house. Sob stood up quite abruptly and turned to Art and said, "It's time. Are we all ready?" "Yes, we are," Art replied while looking at both Aman and Jammu. They all stood up, and Sob led them out to a path past the fruit trees. Aman then realized that the path continued into the forest. He was just about to ask Art where they were going, when he whispered in his ear, "Today, we are only here to witness." The path through the forest narrowed, and they were walking in a single file. Sob led the way, followed by Jammu, Aman, and Art was behind him. The morning sunlight sipped through the forest trees over the path. As they walked deeper into the woods, the vegetation grew denser, and they were suddenly in the jungle. "Do not worry," Jammu whispered to Aman after seeing the look on his face. "Sob knows this area like the back of his hands," he continued. After a long while, they came to a cleared area when Sob suggested that they take a short break. They were sitting on a cleared circular patch of grass with tall wild ferns surrounding them. Sob then reached for his shirt pocket and unfolded the paper wrap. In it were brownish-green colored leaves with white and pale yellow dots on them. He then took a couple and put into his mouth and started to chew. Then he offered them to the rest of the group. As Aman chewed, he could taste the sweetness, with a tinge of bitterness in the leaves. "From what tree are these leaves from, Sob?" he asked, trying not to sound rude. "They are from the fanti plant. It's a shrub, and there are a variety of species growing in the wild on this island," he answered. "People who venture into the jungle consumed them for energy," he continued. Jammu then reached for his bag and passed the water canteens. Sob drank his, but he did not swallow. Instead, he gargled, swishing the water in his mouth and then spit it out. The others then did the same. The sun was just above them, but due to the thick foliage from the surrounding trees, it was rather cool where they were. They sat there in silence, and all Aman could hear was the sound of the jungle. His mind then started to wander and somehow brought him to think of his journey. He started tracing back from the time he left his village on the west coast, the only place he had ever known. And miraculously, he found himself there, in the jungle with practically strangers. He suddenly noticed how clear his recollections were. When he thought of Anna, it felt as though he never left. The feelings he felt then, the appreciation, gratitude, and affection, never changed. He felt elated. "What a wonderful feeling," he murmured, and the sound of his voice made him open his eyes. He suddenly realized that he was lying on his back. Sun rays hit his retina through the thick leafy trees. The rays were somewhat soothing, and when he looked at the tall ferns surrounding the grassy patch, he felt safe and secure. He then sat up and looked around for the others. Art was the only one there, looking at him and smiling. "We must go to meet the others," he said. "Where are they, Art?" Amon asked. "Down the creek to cool and refill the canteens," he replied. There was a sense of directness, with the interaction they just had, that Amon just could not help noticing. It's more like a feeling that he had forgotten, but have always existed. They both then walked down to the creek. When they got there, Sob and Jemmu were nowhere in sight. Across the stream, there was an opening in the jungle. They must have gone through there, Amon thought to himself. Art then took off his shoes and asked Amon to do the same. "We are going to wade the stream," he said. Art then showed Amon how to tie the two laces together and secure them onto their waist belts. When they were done, they hit the waters. But instead of heading for the opening in the jungle, they went upstream. The rushing water was cool and clear, and they were walking on slippery stones and pebbles. Amon focused on every step he took, and could feel every stone he stepped on, underneath his bare feet. After a while, he got accustomed to the different textures of each of them. He could tell which was slipperier than others, and he was amazed at his newfound ability. He then had a sudden realization that he was a part of everything that was taking place. He paused for a moment and looked up, and saw the beauty of the branching trees against the backdrop of the blue sky. The sound of the water streaming down was like an invitation for him to just let go and merge. "Stay with me," Art suddenly said to Amon with a giggle. "We don't want you to get blown away, do we?" he warned. Somehow, Amon knew exactly what he meant, and they both laughed. "This is magic, Art," he exclaimed with excitement. Now. "You have seen nothing yet," Art said and came closer to look him in the eyes. Amon could only see kindness in those eyes and embraced him. He then had a sudden urge to touch the water, and bent over to scoop the water with cupped hands to wet his face. The moment he reopened his eyes, he saw Sob and Jemmu waving from a distance, not so far away from where they were. Art then whispered in Amon's ear, "Remember the slippery stones and the rushing water, but try not to lose your way." Amon understood instantly what he meant, and they both pushed upstream with inner silence until they got to where the others were. Not a word was spoken when they came together. Sob, with his hand, signaled the rest to follow. Not so long after, Amon could hear waves hitting the shore. All of a sudden, through an opening, they were back at the village. They then followed a path, different from when they left, and reached the fruit trees behind Sob's house. Art then quickly said thank you to the two men, and Amon did the same and bid farewell. Art was quiet as they walked, but Amon's got many questions to ask him. "Save it for later," was Art's reply whenever Amon tried to ask a question. They reached the big boulders where Chow and the guest were, as they were packing up to leave. They seemed happy with their day's catch. Amon looked into a basket and spotted some crabs and big lobsters among the fish. "We are going back to the boat," Art announced to all of them. Amon then looked to the western sky and noticed that the sun was about to reach the horizon. He helped them with their baskets and shared light conversations with the tourist while they leisurely walked. When they got to the wharf, Lavenda was standing by the boat with bags and boxes on the floor of the pontoon. Aman helped her load them into the boat. All aboard, they sailed into the sunset. Chapter 4. The Chant. After several trips out to sea, Aman already got familiar with his duties, and knew the overall workings of the motor and the general maintenance of the boat. There were floodings in the low-lying areas of the town due to heavy rain for the past couple of days. People were moved to higher ground, where they were put into town shelters. Art had chosen not to go out to the island that week, mainly for safety reasons. Aman was asked to help at the shipyard, for there were many fishing boats and yachts that needed repair. He didn't mind it at all because he would always learn something new whenever he was there among the shipwrights. Due to the strong winds and big waves hitting the Mariner, numerous decks and sideboards were damaged. That week he had worked overtime, at times until the early morning hours. There he made new friends, from sailors to yachtsmen, and often go for breakfast together with them. The fine weather finally returned towards the end of the week. Art and the crew were ready to sail again. Aman inspected the trawler, and because of where it was safely moored before the storm, there were no damages. The arrangement was always the same whenever they leave the mainland. He would wait at the old pier around 8 p.m., and Art and the rest of the crew, with the new guests, would come by to pick him up. That has always been the rendezvous point for him ever since he joined the crew. When he boarded the boat this time, he noticed that there were 9 people on board instead of the usual 8, for crew and 4 guests. Aman, this is my dear old friend Mansour. He had just returned from a long trip, Art said. I have heard so much about you from Art. So good to meet you, Mansour said during the handshake. Aman did not know what to say at that moment. His mind just went blanked, but he managed to bow and smiled to show some respect. They sat there among the guests while Art and Mansour had a conversation. Aman looked at the man from the corner of his eyes and noticed that he was very well dressed, with a white short-sleeved shirt tugged into his pants, and holding a white hat. He was quite tall and muscular, and despite his elderly appearance, it was difficult to guess his age. After a week's break from the sea, Aman realized how much he enjoyed being out there with the guests and the crew. There, among them, he felt relaxed and calm, and whenever he tried, he just could not figure out the reason. On that night, after a hearty late dinner, everybody left for their huts to get an early night's sleep, for they got an early start the next day. Art had planned to take them hiking to a freshwater lake on the island. Aman had some servicing to do to the boat's engine, so Art let him stay back. It was a warm night. After he helped Lavenda with the cleaning up, he decided to sleep out on the beach, and there under the bright stars, he dozed off. He was suddenly awakened in the morning to the sound of hammering. He rubbed his eyes and rushed up to his hut. As he got there, a man suddenly appeared from behind the banana trees that bordered the neighboring hut. He had a brown khaki overall on, and wore a baseball cap. "Good morning," he said. "I hope I did not wake you up in your slumber," he apologized as he took off his cap. "Good morning," Aman replied. "And no, it is quite all right. It was time I woke up," he said reassuringly. The man then reached out his hand to him. "My name is Rushi, but you can call me Ollie. I am the handyman and caretaker of this place, but usually, when no one is around," he said. "I'm Aman, pleased to meet you," he said as they shook. It was the first time he encountered someone there, apart from the usual group, that he felt somewhat awkward. What are you building back there, Ollie? He asked. Just an addition. When it's ready, the occupant will be more comfortable for an extended stay, Ollie replied. Amon couldn't help to wonder who that occupant might be. As far as he knew, nobody ever stayed back whenever they left. One possible candidate, he thought, was Mansour. Is Mansour going to stay in that hut? He asked without any deliberation. He then realized what he had just said and immediately apologized. I'm so sorry, Ollie. I don't mean to pry. I don't know why I thought that, he said. It is perfectly okay, and the answer is no, it is not for Mansour. Come, let's go for breakfast that Lavenda had prepared for us, he then said. There was something about Ollie that reminded him of Art. He felt very at ease with him. Together, they walked down to the kitchen, where Lavenda was waiting. Come eat before the food gets cold, she said when they arrived. After breakfast, Amon went to work on the motor. Fishing boats were returning from their early morning haul. Lavenda also decided to do some sweeping and cleaning on the boat, while Ollie continued his work on the hut. When they had finished their chores, Amon and Lavenda sat at the edge of the pontoon, dangling their feet above the water. She then started to hum a tune that sounded more like a chant. Amon thought that the melody was beautiful, and after a while, he could make out the structure of the tune. He listened attentively and unexpectedly found himself singing along with her. They sat there chanting until nothing else mattered, and time stood still. A feeling of peace engulfed him. He then turned to look at Lavenda, and she was glowing. Come with me, Amon, she said. He did not feel any apprehension and followed her. They were in a foggy area, full of little bubbles hovering everywhere. She then whispered, Stay close to me, we are going for a ride. The bubbles cleared, and the mist radiated where they passed. Amon then realized that he was glowing too, just like Lavenda. Well done, Amon, she uttered. Then the mist cleared, and all of a sudden, Amon was looking down on the lighthouse. From up there he could see the designs on the floor surrounding the glass roof. He then felt that they were tumbling towards it. The mist suddenly reappeared, and shortly they were back at the pontoon. Lavenda was wrapping her arms around him. The sound of the surroundings slowly returned. Let's walk to the kitchen, Lavenda then said. When they got there, she gave him a glass of water to drink. This will keep you calm and collected, she said. We have traveled quite a distance, she went on. I saw the lighthouse, Lavenda, Amon said abruptly. Yes. Today, you are not ready to descend yet, she said. She then made him lie in one of the hammocks. Close your eyes and just listen to my voice, she then said. You must practice moving a short distance first, and by yourself. But do not worry, I'm watching over you. Do you understand? She asked. Amon understood what she said and nodded. As he laid there, he felt sleepy and just about to fall asleep when he heard the sound of thumping on wood. As he listened, he became aware of indentations in between them. The gaps are like dark spots, and one came close and encompassed him. The sound then overlapped each other like an echo. Someone was knocking at the door. He quickly ran to open it. Standing outside in front of him was Ollie. Well, 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 look who's here, he said with a big grin, and stared at Amon from head to toe. About a few feet behind Ollie, there were small boulders stacked in a circle. Just look around. Soon the garden pool will be ready, he continued. Aman then realized that he was at the hut where Ollie was working. He saw the frames to the extension that Ollie mentioned earlier was almost completed. He wanted to say something, but he could not voice it out. Save all the chatter for later. Just absorb the moment. Acquaint yourself to this place, for you will come here quite frequent from now on, Ollie then said. Aman stood there looking at everything around him without a single thought. The streaks on the wooden beams were so detailed, and it was just what it is. The line of banana trees around the hut is where it should be. Then he heard a voice saying, "Save your strength. Just let things take care of themselves." He opened his eyes, and Lavenda was there smiling. Thoughts slowly re-emerged into Aman's mind, but somehow he felt detached from them. He could discern the wavelength and frequencies the thoughts emitted, and it sounded like music to him. Lavenda then helped him stand up and walk him on the strand. A while later, there was a commotion of people talking, coming from the woody area behind the huts. Art suddenly appeared with Chow, Mansoor, and the guests. They all gathered around the kitchen table, displaying their freshwater catch. Art then announced that they would have dinner before leaving for the mainland. Aman helped Lavenda prepare the food of baked fish and beans, and they dined into the twilight. Chapter 5. The Lighthouse. After knocking on the front door several times, he realized that nobody was home. The van was not in front of the house, and as he was about to leave, a next-door neighbor peeked over the side fence. "Hello, you must be Aman," she said, clutching her newborn baby. "Yes, I am," he answered. "Pooja and the family have gone to Medan to visit Oba's ailing mother. They asked me to tell you whenever you come," she said. "Oh, did they say when they will be back?" he asked. "They will be away for a couple of weeks," Kale said before they left yesterday, she answered. He then thanked her, patted the infant's little feet, and left. It was a sunny morning and children were at play on the lawns of their houses. Up the road, near the entrance to the terraces, hawkers were getting ready to set up their makeshift stalls. Aman knew a few of them and they waved. He then decided to walk to his favorite place near the lighthouse to soak in the sunshine and the morning sea breeze. As he walked up the steps to the elevated ground of the park, he noticed a man sitting on his favorite bench. There was a group of young children on the grassy front flying their kites. As he got closer to the bench, a dog suddenly appeared, running and barking at the kites. Even the dog loves to see kites in flight. A voice came from behind where Aman was standing. He turned and was surprised to see Ollie sitting on the bench. "Ollie, what are you doing here?" he exclaimed. "Well, Art told me this is where I can find you. Coincidentally, this is my favorite spot too," Ollie said with a beaming smile. Aman was genuinely happy to see him. There are plenty of questions he wanted to ask, and just wouldn't know where to start. Ever since he got back from that day on the island, he had been having unusual gaps in his memory. He had vivid dreams when he went to sleep and then find himself waking up in the dream. He sometimes felt that he was losing his mind. Aman voiced out his quandary to Ollie, who listened attentively. "I was where you are now, not so long ago, when I lost the line between sleep and wakefulness," Ollie said. Aman found a little comfort in what Ollie had just said. "Who are you, Ollie? What does all this mean?" he asked. Ollie stood up and stretched his legs and arms. "Let's go sit at those comfortable chairs by the lighthouse. There I will tell you my story," he said. When they got there, Aman noticed the enormity of the building. He followed Ollie to an inclined grassy area. There, in a cozy corner under a shady tree, stood a round iron table with 2 chairs on its side. It was so much quieter there in front of the lighthouse facing the open sea. Aman could faintly hear the children playing from where they were. The sun shone through a patch of clouds, creating a beautiful hue on that part of the sea. Once they were comfortably seated, Ollie reached into his trouser pocket and took out a figurine. He then passed it to Aman to hold and feel. It was a piece of coral carved into a small sailboat. Aman noticed that it was beautifully sculpted, with so many fine details on it. I had so much time to spare when I was the keeper of this lighthouse, Ollie said. It then suddenly struck Aman that Ollie was the caretaker friend Art had mentioned not so long ago. He said that someday he would introduce Aman to him, since the area had become his favorite spot. Upon hearing what Aman just relayed, Ollie smiled. "We are connected in ineffable ways," he said. "I was a marine biologist from Medan doing my fieldwork in this coastal region about 25 years ago. I was not much older than you are now," he went on, as though not to let Aman interrupt. "When I first got here, I was hunting down a place to live through the classified ads in the local newspaper. I needed a place near the seaside where I can easily do my research, but I was luckless. While staying at the motel, I met a few residents from out of town who worked in this area. One of them was a man from a chair, who was about to leave his job as the keeper of the lighthouse. To make the story short, I managed to be his replacement, and this lighthouse became the perfect place for me to do what I was here to do. As the months went by, I got myself into a kind of routine, juggling between my duties as a keeper of the lighthouse and my research work. Often I ventured out to sea and occasionally do some deep diving along the coast as part of my study of the marine life there. My work was also to chart the area where I did the fieldwork, and, from all the charts and maps of that area that I had with me, there was no island." Ollie then paused, looking at Aman, as though waiting for a reaction from him. Aman was at a loss for words, open-mouthed, dumbfounded. "I must tell you this now, that there is no island. If you can accept that, it will help you deal with the shift between sleep and wakefulness," Ollie continued. "But, how can that be? I know I was there with you and the others only days ago." "Do you mean that all this time, it is not real, Ollie?" Aman complained. "I'm not saying that it is not real. It is as real as today, here and now. Perhaps, after I finish with my story, you will get a clearer picture and a better perspective. Patches of clouds are gradually moving in from the southeast, occasionally blocking the sun as they passed. The wind over the water had created swirling designs on the surface. It is difficult to speak about the abstract," Ollie continued. "People who have attempted end up being misunderstood and most often ridiculed. The messages of masters and teachers, gurus and prophets, throughout the ages, now live in a library of twisted words," he went on. "Why is that so, Ollie?" Aman asked. "That's just simply the nature of words. They are always one step behind. That is why the evolved ones choose to act instead. Like most people, from where I come from, we grew up in a strict religious environment, and we are not unique in that matter. Every child born will leave the cradle to walk, then talk, and not long after learns to abide by the rules. For generations, we were taught to accept only this one reality. In other words, we are caged in. It is nobody's fault that we are in this predicament. The good news is that we evolve as humans, and nothing stands in the way of evolution. Still, if not for my chance encounter, I would be among the unconscious, and wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation with you, Ollie said with a glint in his eyes. What chance encounter, Ollie? Aman asked, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. Once you can quieten your mind for an elongated period, and practice being in a state of stillness, all things will become clear. Right now you are in the process of achieving that state. Lavenda is helping you, prompting you on. Unlike you, it took a long time for me to make the shift due to my inflexibility. Now I feel grateful and fortunate to have met them, and will forever be in debt for the knowledge they have bestowed upon me, Ollie said. The wind suddenly picked up, and patches of dark clouds were moving towards the mainland. Perhaps there is something I can add here to alleviate some of your confusion pertaining to the island. Your teacher should be the right person to explain this, but since we don't have much time, I will tell you what my teacher taught me. Ollie deliberated for a moment, then continued. Our eyes only see what we are accustomed to seeing, he proceeded. For instance, for you to understand something that you never knew before, you have to engage your undivided attention. The same goes when a child learns from their peers, only to conform to what we call reality. Collectively, as humans, we have agreed, through constant reminder, that this is the way it is, so it becomes what it is. But we have forgotten that it is all just an arrangement. We are much more than that, as you are now slowly starting to see. As children, we were made to choose without having a choice. Once we become aware that it is only a choice, we can be more accepting of the possibilities of other worlds, and hopefully, we won't get trapped in them as we do here. When my teacher first explained this, it didn't make much sense to me. So, do not worry about your lack of clarity, Ollie then said. After all that time, there had always been a lingering question in Aman's mind. He thought it was the most appropriate time to ask. Who are these people, Ollie? And the guests, where do they come from? He blurted out. It's about time you ask. A long time ago I got my answer right from the horse's mouth himself, my teacher, Ollie said laughing. I guess, since you've asked, it's all right that I'll be the one to tell you. The guests are sleepers, ordinary people like you and me, having vivid dreams in a course of a night's sleep. The crew on that trawler are from another time. If you like, they are time travelers. But that is not an accurate assumption, because they're from a timeless realm. In truth, they are humans who have evolved. For them, the future is constantly unfolding, and the past are forms subsiding. They live in the present, and the light of the lighthouse is a beacon for them. Lavenda tried to show you that the other day. Then she made you move, and by yourself, and you managed to come to where I was working at the hut. That was a great feat and a sign for her that you're ready. She is your true teacher. When you are going to make the journey, she will be flanking you all the way. According to them, you are less cloudy than most people, probably because of your early upbringing, always having to fend for yourself. They were pleased with your achievement that Art decided to stay a while longer for dinner, if you can recall. You are lucky to have Lavenda as your ward. As for me, because of my hard-headedness, I had a sterner teacher in Mansoor, Ollie said laughing. You have made that journey, can you tell me what to expect, Ollie? Aman asked. Nobody can even try to answer that, Aman. You will be like a kite and the forces of nature decide. But then again, you will also realize that at the same time, you're also the flyer on the string, he said. Will I be the same when I return? Aman asked. Of course, but you will gradually shed your skin and move away from your old mundane existence. The decision and the time to make the journey will be up to you. When you're ready, you will know what to do, Ollie said. The sun had disappeared behind the thick clouds overhead. Ollie then stood up. I think it's lunchtime, he declared, rubbing his tummy. They both laughed and strolled back to town in the drizzling rain. Pigeons were pecking on the window pane as he woke up. The sporadic rainy season had finally arrived. He emptied the bucket underneath the leaky roof and then cracked a couple of eggs for his usual scrambled on toast. After breakfast, Amon sat by the window of his little kitchenette, looking over the rooftops at the surrounding hills. The early morning rain had stopped and the roof tiles glistened under the sun. He had heard that you could sometimes see the Barisan mountain range on a clear day, and he had not once forgotten his village by the ocean that lies beyond. As his mind wandered, he noticed a patch of fog, slowly drifting down towards the nearby trees on the hill slope. He became focused as he gazed, following its path, and unaware attained stillness. Suddenly he felt a tingling on his chest, and realized the fog surrounding him. Something in him then called out, Lavenda. It echoed like he was in a cave. He heard a voice reverberated back towards him. Yes, Amon, and there she appeared in front of him. She placed both her hands on Amon's shoulders as if to hold him down. Very faintly he heard Lavenda telling him to look down to the floor. Looking down he saw designs on it, and he instantly remembered seeing them from up above. They were standing on the floor, at the top of the lighthouse. Just gaze at the floor, she said, while they walked a full circle around the glass dome. Lavenda then looked into his eyes. Are you with me, Amon? She asked. Amon felt that he had just woken up from a dream. Is all this real, Lavenda? He asked. Lavenda giggled and said, as real as you want it to be. He noticed the silence within him. He felt that he had finally arrived, and there was not much need for any justification. In the emptiness, he found completion and fruition. How had he forgotten? He heard a voice in his head. Amon knew then, without knowing, that he was ready. He turned to Lavenda, and she was smiling at him. She then started to hum, and Amon knew the tune and joined her. In the stillness, they glowed.